Picture this. You are standing in the dusty courtyard of a Roman estate in 150 AD, watching as a man examines human beings the same way he might inspect livestock at market. The morning sun beats down mercilessly as he pries open mouths to check teeth, runs his hands along muscles to assess strength, and forces women to lift their tunics while he evaluates their reproductive potential. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and human misery, punctuated by the metallic clinking of iron shackles that have worn bloody grooves into ankles and wrists. Your stomach churns as you realize this is not merely slavery as we understand it from textbooks. This is something far more systematic, far more calculated, and infinitely more horrifying. This is human breeding, where people are reduced to nothing more than reproductive machinery in service of economic profit. Before diving into these forgotten stories of exploitation and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The ancient world operated on principles that would shock modern sensibilities, where human beings were categorized and valued based solely on their to produce more slaves. From the marble halls of Roman villas to the mud brick compounds of Mesopotamian estates, from the terraced fields of ancient China to the stone pyramids of pre-Columbian America, powerful civilizations developed sophisticated systems for breeding human beings like cattle. These were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully planned economic strategies that treated human reproduction as just another form of agricultural production. The Roman Empire perfected the art of slave breeding to a degree that modern historians struggle to fully comprehend. Wealthy Romans maintained detailed breeding records that tracked bloodlines, reproductive cycles, and genetic traits with the same precision they applied to their prized horses and hunting dogs. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii reveals elaborate charts painted on villa walls that documented which enslaved women were paired with which men, tracking pregnancy rates and survival statistics with chilling clinical detachment. Marcus Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest citizens, owned over 500 slaves specifically designated for breeding purposes. His estate records, preserved in fragmentary papyrus documents, reveal a systematic approach that divided enslaved people into breeding categories based on physical attributes, intelligence, and specialized skills. Strong field workers were paired with robust women to produce laborers. Attractive slaves were bred with others of similar appearance to create aesthetically pleasing household servants. Educated slaves were matched according to intellectual abilities to generate literate offspring who could serve as scribes and tutors. The breeding quarters on Roman estates were designed with the same attention to efficiency found in modern industrial farming. Separate dormitories housed breeding males and females, with carefully controlled access between the two groups. Overseers maintained detailed schedules that determined when and with whom each enslaved person would mate. Privacy was non-existent, intimacy was forbidden, and human sexuality was reduced to a purely mechanical function designed to maximize reproductive output. Roman law provided no protection for enslaved families. Children born into bondage became the automatic property of their mother's owner, regardless of who their father might be. Fathers had no legal rights to their offspring and could be sold away at any moment. Mothers might nurse their infants for a few months before having the children permanently removed, to be raised in group nurseries, overseen by elderly enslaved women who had outlived their reproductive usefulness. The psychological trauma inflicted by these systems defies modern comprehension. Enslaved people lived in constant fear that their children would be sold, their partners reassigned, and their most intimate relationships severed without warning. Roman writers like Seneca occasionally expressed discomfort with these practices, but their concerns focused on the moral effects on slave owners rather than the suffering of the enslaved. Ancient Mesopotamian civilizations developed equally sophisticated breeding systems that treated human reproduction as a state-managed resource. Babylonian tablets from the reign of Hammurabi contain detailed regulations governing slave breeding, including specific punishments for enslaved people who attempted to prevent pregnancy or harm their offspring. The Code of Hammurabi explicitly states that enslaved women who refused to bear children could be tortured or executed, while those who produced healthy offspring might receive minor privileges like better food or clothing. Mesopotamian temple complexes maintained vast breeding operations that supplied enslaved workers for construction projects, agricultural labor, and religious ceremonies. Archaeological excavations at Ur have revealed dormitory complexes designed specifically for housing breeding populations, complete with separate quarters for pregnant women and nurseries for infants. These facilities operated on an industrial scale, processing hundreds of human beings through carefully controlled reproductive cycles. The ancient Egyptian empire approached slave breeding with the same architectural precision they applied to pyramid construction. Egyptian papyrus records describe breeding programs that spanned generations, with detailed genealogical charts tracking family lines through multiple lifetimes. The Egyptians believed that certain genetic combinations produced superior workers, leading to elaborate experiments in human selective breeding that continued for centuries. Egyptian overseers maintained breeding calendars synchronized with agricultural seasons, timing pregnancies to ensure that births occurred during periods when female workers could be temporarily spared from field labor. They developed sophisticated understanding of human reproductive cycles, using this knowledge to maximize pregnancy rates while minimizing disruption to economic productivity. The Great Wall of China stands as one of history's most impressive architectural achievements, but historical records reveal that its construction relied heavily on systematically bred enslaved populations. Chinese imperial records describe massive breeding complexes, established specifically to produce workers for major construction projects. These facilities operated for decades, producing generation after generation of humans whose sole purpose was to provide labor for state projects. Chinese breeding programs incorporated elements of traditional medicine and philosophy, with overseers consulting astrological charts to determine optimal times for conception. They believed that children conceived during certain celestial alignments would possess superior physical strength or intellectual abilities, leading to elaborate scheduling systems that treated human reproduction as a form of cosmic engineering. The Aztec Empire developed perhaps the most ritualized approach to slave breeding, incorporating religious ceremonies into reproductive practices. Aztec codices describe elaborate festivals dedicated to fertility gods, during which enslaved people were required to participate in mass breeding ceremonies believed to ensure divine blessing on their offspring. These events combined religious devotion with systematic human reproduction in ways that reflected the Aztec worldview's integration of spiritual and economic concerns. Aztec breeding programs were closely tied to their military expansion, with successful warriors receiving access to the most prized breeding slaves as rewards for battlefield achievements. The children produced through these unions were often designated for specific roles in Aztec society, including future military service or sacrifice in religious ceremonies. The Mayan civilization developed breeding systems that combined astronomical knowledge with human reproduction, in ways that reveal their sophisticated understanding of both celestial cycles and genetic inheritance. Mayan stone tablets discovered at Tikal describe breeding centers where enslaved people were paired according to complex calculations based on birth dates, physical characteristics, and perceived spiritual qualities. These facilities operated under the direct supervision of priest astronomers, who believed that children conceived during specific planetary alignments would inherit supernatural abilities or enhanced physical traits. Mayan overseers maintained meticulous records carved into stone monuments that tracked breeding outcomes across multiple generations. They identified family lines that consistently produced children with desired characteristics, then concentrated these genetic traits through carefully controlled marriages that treated human beings as experimental subjects in long-term breeding projects. The surviving records reveal breeding programs that spanned centuries, with some family lines tracked for over 10 generations. The physical infrastructure supporting these operations was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Mayan breeding complexes included specialized buildings for different stages of reproduction, from courtship areas where potential partners were evaluated, to birthing chambers equipped with stone tables for deliveries, to nurseries where infants were raised according to predetermined social roles. These facilities processed thousands of enslaved people through systematic reproductive cycles that supplied labor for massive construction projects, including temples, palaces, and agricultural terraces. Ancient Persian breeding programs reflected the empire's vast geographic scope and cultural diversity. Persian administrative records describe breeding centers established across territories stretching from India to Egypt, each adapted to local conditions while maintaining standardized procedures for human reproduction. The Persians developed sophisticated transportation networks specifically for moving breeding populations between different regions, creating genetic diversity while maintaining centralized control over reproductive outcomes. Persian breeding operations were closely integrated with their military expansion strategies. Conquered populations were systematically relocated to breeding centers where they were paired with slaves from other regions, creating mixed populations that had no shared cultural identity or geographic loyalty. This deliberate fragmentation prevented enslaved communities from developing cohesive resistance movements while producing genetically diverse offspring for various labor needs. The Persian system included elaborate classification schemes that categorized enslaved people according to dozens of physical and intellectual criteria. Administrative tablets describe evaluation processes that measured everything from hand size and muscle density to memory capacity and artistic ability. These assessments determined breeding assignments with mathematical precision, treating human genetics as a resource to be optimized through careful planning and systematic control. Greek city-states approached slave breeding with the same intellectual rigor they applied to philosophy and mathematics. Greek scholars wrote extensive treatises on human breeding techniques, analyzing the relationship between physical characteristics and reproductive outcomes with clinical detachment. These academic works treated enslaved people as subjects for scientific inquiry, documenting breeding experiments with the same methodical approach used for studying plant cultivation or animal husbandry. Athenian breeding facilities were designed according to principles derived from Greek architectural theory, with buildings arranged to optimize supervision and control. Archaeological evidence reveals dormitory complexes where enslaved people were housed in carefully segregated groups based on breeding assignments. These facilities included specialized rooms for medical examinations, mating activities, and childbirth, all designed to maximize reproductive efficiency while minimizing the possibility of emotional attachment between breeding partners. Greek breeding programs incorporated elements of their medical knowledge, with physicians monitoring pregnancy progress and intervening to prevent complications that might reduce reproductive output. These medical interventions were motivated entirely by economic considerations, treating enslaved women's bodies as a valuable reproductive machinery that required maintenance and optimization. The Carthaginian Empire developed maritime breeding networks that transported enslaved populations across the Mediterranean Sea, creating genetic mixing programs that spanned continents. Carthaginian records describe floating breeding facilities aboard specially designed ships that served as mobile reproduction centers during long trading voyages. These vessels included separate compartments for different breeding groups, allowing systematic human reproduction to continue even during months-long sea journeys. Carthaginian breeding operations were closely integrated with their commercial activities, producing enslaved workers with skills specifically suited for different trade routes and markets. They developed expertise in matching human characteristics to labor demands, creating breeding programs that produced miners for Spanish silver operations, agricultural workers for North African grain production, and household servants for wealthy urban markets. The scale of these operations defies modern imagination. Historical records suggest that major Carthaginian breeding centers processed over 1,000 enslaved people annually through systematic reproductive cycles. These facilities operated with industrial efficiency, treating human reproduction as just another form of manufacturing that required careful planning, quality control, and continuous optimization. Celtic tribes in pre-Roman Europe maintained their own breeding traditions that reflected their warrior culture and tribal social structures. Celtic breeding practices were less centralized than those of major empires, but equally systematic in their approach to human reproduction. Tribal leaders maintained breeding rights over captured enemies, treating reproductive capacity as spoils of war that could be distributed among loyal followers. As the sun sets over the ruins of these ancient empires, their monuments to human achievement casting long shadows across the earth, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that our greatest civilizations were built upon the systematic destruction of human dignity. These breeding programs represent more than historical curiosity or academic study. They reveal the depths of cruelty that organized societies can reach when human beings are reduced to mere economic calculations. The echoes of these practices remind us that the capacity for such systematic dehumanization lies dormant in every civilization, waiting to emerge whenever we forget that behind every economic system, every political structure, and every social hierarchy, there beat the hearts of individual human beings whose capacity for love, hope, and suffering transcends any attempt to reduce them to mere breeding stock.